operation to kill each other. I mean, that's what it really is. All the rest of the events up here are just going to serve as catalysts to speed up the process a little bit. The Mexican War. We took 1/3 of Mexico, and we added 1/3 to the United States. And we did provoke Mexico in that war. Interesting, if you read Mexican history books to this day, they refer to our Civil War as Mexico's revenge. And why do they do that? All this new territory that we're going to add from the Mexican War, we're going to argue about expansion of slavery into this new territory and eventually go to war because we can't agree. So Mexico didn't shed a tear during our Civil War or what we were doing to each other, because we had basically taken part of their... It ends in 1848 in February at a place called Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's, but you can see an option for slavery again. Chance they couldn't expand further south, they couldn't go east. Cotton doesn't grow very well in Oklahoma, okay? And, you know, so they're looking at places like California, which is being added. They're looking at other places that have possibilities to grow cotton. The fugitive, well, the Compromise of 1850. At the right-hand side, temporary unsatisfactory settlement. Part of that compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. And it basically was to protect slavery. It was a gift to the South. That the bounty hunters were the ones within the law. And if you had aided and abetted an escaping slave, you could be fined $1,000 and imprisoned. Now we're going to get to the Underground Railroad here in a minute. But fugitive slaves returned and rescued in the North. And we'll talk about Iowa's role. Personal liberty laws passed in the North. The North did exactly what the South had done over the Tariff. They passed laws exempting them from the Fugitive Slave Act. Part of that Compromise of 1850 was California comes in as a free state. As a free state. That really angered Southerners, because that was one of the few areas where they knew they could grow cotton in parts of California. And then again, they banned the slave trade within any site of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. That's part of the compromise. The Fugitive Slave Act is part of the compromise. All right? And that this country, initially there were no political parties. By 1800, there are two factions. You know, by the 1820s, there's one dominant party, the party of Andy Jackson and Thomas Jefferson, the early Democratic Party. But then you start seeing the rise of a lot of third parties over issues like immigration, over issues like slavery, all right? The Know Nothing Party, some of you probably heard of that, okay? The Whig Party, our most successful third party, elected 3 people president, and so on. So the party system is starting to come unglued a little bit. And both the National Democrats are splitting North and South over slavery, The Austin Manifesto, because we couldn't expand slavery west, was to try to expand slavery into Central America and South America. It's going to fail as well. The formation of the Republican Party. There's a little town, if you drive down Highway 218 to St. Louis, you pass a little town, there's a bridge there, an overpass, but there's a big sign. It's called Crawfordsville, Iowa. So I'm sure most of you have driven that way. That is one of 2 places that argue about who's the rightful birthplace of the Republican Party. The other one is Ripon, Wisconsin, all right? The Wisconsin side has a better argument. But that new party in the 1850s is really an outgrowth over the split in the Democratic Party, over the issue of slavery, the decline of the Whigs and some of these other parties. And that reinforced the image of Democratic parties favoring slavery, and reopened the settled issue of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Senator Douglas, Stephen Douglas from Illinois introduced that. And go back up to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That basically said, we're going to let Missouri in as a pro-slave state, Maine as a free state, but nothing above the latitude line 3630 out of the Louisiana Purchase territory, we wouldn't allow slavery in any of that. This reopens the possibility of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. And the term popular sovereignty, you already know the word sovereignty. Let the people that move into Missouri or move into Kansas and Nebraska vote on whether they want to be pro-slave or anti-slave. Pro-slave or anti-slave. Go ahead. That's the result, the top one up there. For a while, Kansas has 2 governments, 2 capitals, 2 legislatures, One pro, one anti, and then they go to war. They burn half of Lawrence, Kansas. Foretaste of the Civil War. 200 killed, 2 million in property. Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts. He's an outspoken abolitionist opposed to slavery. He gives a speech on the floor of the Senate. A Southern senator comes up to him after the speech, takes out his cane and splits his skull open. From 1856 till the war breaks out, members of the House and the Senate carried knives, pistols on the floor of the Senate. I mean, the word compromise was disappearing quickly. Now, just for a second, a little game I played with my students. How many presidents can you name off the top of your head between James K. Polk and Abraham Lincoln? I don't need to show of hands, but a lot of people can't name very many in there. And there's a reason for that, okay? They're ineffective. Buchanan's pro-slave, Pierce is pro-slave, okay? They're weak presidents when we desperately need a strong president in the 1850s. If the presidents are weak and they're splitting skulls open on the floor of the Senate, well, how about the Supreme Court helping out on this? Dred Scott versus Sanford, Roger Taney, that not only are free blacks, not recognized by the Constitution, they have no rights. It's not just slaves. Taney was appointed by Andy Jackson, a Democrat, and Andy Jackson owned over 100 slaves. So should it surprise you that Roger Taney says that blacks have no rights in this country in Dred Scott versus Sanford? So he's dead, all right? I talked already a little bit about the two different capitals and constitutions in Kansas. You've got the Lincoln-Douglas debates are all about slavery, and Lincoln's views will start to change after those. Douglas is more on the right than Lincoln is, as he runs against him and loses. John Brown. If you've been down to the Capitol, when I was on the board, there's 10 times as much stuff in the basement. I don't know about you guys have a big basement here or not, but most museums, you can only display so much at a time, and you rotate different exhibits and so on. A lot of county museums are smaller and so on, but the historical building has a carriage that John Brown used. It's got a couple of weapons that were left here by John Brown. You'll see pictures of them in a minute. John Brown comes through Iowa 4 times, helping organize his little army of abolitionists. He recruits Quakers from Iowa. Edwin and Barclay Copy, 2 brothers from Springdale over in eastern Iowa, will ride with John Brown to Harper's Ferry. 6 Iowans are in the group. 2 of them will die, including one of the Copy brothers, and so on. But he's a good friend of Josiah Grinnell, who was an abolitionist. We'll talk about the Underground Railroad. By 1860, you've got 4 candidates in that election. You have Abraham Lincoln, you have Stephen Douglas, you have John Breckinridge, and you have John Bell. And the reason Lincoln only gets 39.9% of the vote is obviously it's a regional, he's elected by regional followers, and that's it. The Democrats split their vote, and you have a third-party John Bell is a third-party candidate. So he wins at 39.9. In December of 1860, South Carolina secedes. And after Lincoln's election, the headlines in the Charleston Mercury said, "Satan occupies White House." They're not subtle about it. They don't want Lincoln. And they secede from the Union. And you can see at the bottom, followed by 6 more states quickly. And what's to stop? Lincoln's inaugurated, and then Fort Sumter, April 12th. How many of you have seen the Ken Burns series on the Civil War? I use it in my classes, a lot of you have. One of the most invaluable sources that Ken Burns used was Mary Chestnut's diary. Mary Chestnut was from the higher echelons of society in the South. She and her husband were friends of Jefferson Davis. The minute the first cannonballs were fired on April 12th at 4:30 in the morning, she starts writing. And she writes and interacts with everybody in the South. She doesn't like slavery. But obviously women had their place. She was a smart, smart woman. And Ken Burns couldn't put that together without using her diaries, and he said that publicly. All right. You read. Yeah. I'll give you a minute to read. I've read this so many times. It's reinforcing a lot of what I've just said. At the bottom, 11 states formed their own union. Northerners fought to hold the country together, viewing secession as an act of treason, unconstitutional. All right, go ahead. Again, we got a population of not quite 750,000 when the war breaks out. The railroads have reached, not far from here. Why do they celebrate Pufferbilly Days? I taught at the DMAC campus in Boone for a number of years. And obviously that's where the railroads stopped when the fighting broke out. You'll meet Grenville Dodge, who was a railroad builder. They needed the young men, not for building railroads anymore. The first bridge was at Davenport and Rock Island. And it reached halfway across the state when the fighting breaks out. And so obviously that wasn't a priority. And you can see it talks a little bit about immigration. The ethnic heritage course that I teach for Humanities Iowa, one of the questions I asked early in my presentation, and I'll ask it here. How many in this room do not have any English, Irish, or German ancestry? Raise a hand. I don't see any hands. We got an outlaw. No, that's who we still are, over 90% in terms of ancestry. We're Northern European. We allow some Eastern and Southern European, and so on. But I'm joking a little bit. Now, the other thing I want you to keep in mind, pattern of settlement in Iowa from the territorial days when it was opened up after the Black Hawk Wars in 1832 is from southeast to northwest along the river valleys. So almost every first in Iowa history is in one of those Mississippi River counties. Dubuque is our oldest incorporated city. The first bridge is in Davenport. The first school is down by Keokuk, and so on. And it makes sense. It makes sense. There's another reason, and it was because of misinformation about agriculture. A lot of people thought that the western part of Iowa, at least half of Iowa, the prairie, wasn't very good for growing crops. The best part was where the hardwood trees were, in the eastern part. Well, we know that's not true. I mean, what's an acre of land in Sioux County selling for now? $15,000 or whatever it is. It's a gold mine, all right? Go ahead. I'll run through these kind of quickly. That is that first bridge that I just mentioned. And the first railroad will get to Iowa City, and obviously our second capital. Burlington's our first capital. And then it stops during the war, railroad building. And it'll be completed in just 2 years after the war ends in 1865. The first railroad to complete crossing Iowa had all kinds of incentives, free land from the government, and they got to Council Bluffs. And that's, and then of course, I think all of you know, from 1867, how long did it take to connect East Coast and West Coast at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10 of 1869? It took 2 years, that's it. It took 2 years to complete half of Iowa. It took 2 years to get the rest of the way across the United States. All right. One of the games historians love to play is what are the most influential books in history? And you can say U.S. history if you want to downsize it a little bit. And always people throw in the Bible, to throw in something from Shakespeare, maybe Darwin, books that have really changed who we are as human beings. Well, a lot of people, especially when you talk about history, will add this one to the list. Abraham Lincoln, after the war, was giving a speech in New York City. And about a third of the way through the speech, one of his aides interrupted him. You don't do that to Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln paused. And he said, I guess we have a special guest here today. And he just started walking down the middle of the aisle, and it was the parting of the Red Sea. And he goes down about halfway and motions. And she's 5'1". She comes over to Lincoln, looks up, and he says, so this is the little lady that started the Great War. All right? You're looking at her. All right? Translated into all kinds of languages. A lot of people are not familiar with the other name for her book. Uncle Tom's Cabin sounds like, my place to get away in Alaska to go bear hunting, okay? No. Life Among the Lowly. This documents how barbaric slavery was. And it becomes an instant international bestseller. And remember this, Britain had freed their slaves, most of European countries, well before we did. Russia had freed their serfs before we do away with slavery. So that's part of why her book had such an appeal. There it is. There is no one route, but I will make some comments about the different routes. You had to have different routes because remember what I said earlier, the bounty hunters are within the law and you are not by helping escape slaves. And you can go to jail and be fined. The Reverend John Todd. You know where Tabor, Iowa is? I did a program there. All right. I've really gotten to know Iowa doing all these programs. And Tabor's in the very, very southwestern corner of the state. Not far from Malvern, all right, and not too far from Lewis. Lewis still has standing the Hitchcock House. One of the major routes was into Tabor. The Reverend John Todd, at Tabor College, Congregationalist College, he helped escape slaves. They went to the Hitchcock House over in Cass County. And it's out on a kind of a small hill, and you can see the house a long ways across open fields, so you can put lanterns in the window, letting escaped slaves know it's safe to come. And then from there, they were Earlham, founded by Quakers. Fontanelle was one of the stop-off sites. Right through Sherman Hill in Des Moines, or the southern route was Winterset, Indianola. This is one of the major sort of routes. And then, I mentioned his name earlier, Josiah Grinnell.